Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. This is David Madison, the Executive Director of the Southwestern Association of Episcopal Schools, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon that focuses on the strategic planning process. So we offer this webinar a couple times a year, and it's becoming one of my favorite sessions to do, so welcome. A few bits of housekeeping before we get started. First, I've received a question about where the PowerPoint slides will be available. They'll be available on our website. It will probably be next week before this deck will be available. But if you go to our website under the resources tab, you will see a webinars tab. And if you click on that, starting next week, you will see a link that will take you to the slide deck. A recording of this webinar will not be available, but the slide deck will. If after this webinar, you have some folks that you think would benefit from attending, then please take a look at our newsletter. If you're not receiving that monthly, let me know and I'll show you how to subscribe to that, and they can pop in the next time we offer this session live. One more bit of housekeeping. I think most of you know where the Q&A box is, but that will be the way that we'll communicate today. So if you have any questions, if you will look to the bottom of your screen and find a button that says Q&A, if you'll click on that, let's take that for a test drive. Click on that, and if you will enter the name of the city where you're located today, we'll make sure those questions are coming through. So let's give that a try. If you'll click on the Q&A box and enter the city that you are currently in. So that's working out. Amarillo, Austin, Nacogdoches, Waco, Houston, Baton Rouge, another Houston, Corpus, welcome, welcome. Okay, that's working great. So thank you all so much. Again, use that button as much as you would like. Make sure that you don't lose a question. So feel free as questions are popping up, just make sure to click those in to the Q&A box so that we will make sure to get those answered as time allows. So thank you all so much for taking that for a test drive. I'm going to clear all the questions out, and then we will get started. Okay, perfect. Let's begin. So let's take a look at what I'd like to accomplish today. 4 different things I'd like to take a look at. First is the role of the Board of Trustees and how the topic for this afternoon is really key to the board living up to its strategic role. The second topic is the process itself. There are myriad ways to schedule this, to facilitate it, everything from doing it all internally, there's models for that, to having a facilitator come in and facilitate some of the conversations, to the other extreme, which would be having a facilitator do the entire process for you in crafting the plan. So the important thing is that there's no one size that fits all. Depending on the size of the school, the budget of the school, there's absolutely no excuse to not have a high quality strategic planning process in place and a current strategic plan. So we'll take a look at one model for strategic planning that works for just about all of my schools. We'll look at some additional resources if you want to do some reading or if you want to take a look at some other models. And then we'll use the balance of the hour for Q&A. So it's about 5 after the hour right now. We'll go a full hour. And then obviously, if you have follow-up questions, feel free to give me a call or an email. Okay, I'd like to share this chart with you. This is a chart from the NAIS trustee handbook, not the most current handbook, but it's one edition back from the current handbook. But I think this chart does a really nice job on explaining what is the board's role, what is the head's role, and what's a shared decision. This is one of the most fundamental concepts for a board and a head to both understand. So if you think of this as 3 different lanes, the top lane where my arrow is right here is what I call the board's lane. These are things that are purely the board's decision, but it would be unwise for a board to engage in these kinds of decisions without receiving the advice of the head of school. In the same way, the bottom lane or the operational lane is the head of school's lane. But in most situations, while things fall to the head for her or his decision, It is well advised to keep the board advised of the situation, your counsel from the board, and not function in a vacuum. The middle lane is where things get a little bit tricky because those are shared decisions. So things like enrollment management. So things like what's the optimal class size? What's the capacity of the physical plant? Those types of things tend to be shared decisions. Large financial authorizations tend to be shared decisions as well. So where are we today? Well, today, this is clearly a top lane call, specifically a strategy call. So the strategic planning process falls to the board. Now, the logistics and making sure it happens and making sure the board has the information that they need is frequently something that the head is called to do, but the concept itself of strategic planning is something that falls to the responsibility of the board. So if there's not a current strategic plan, if the strategic planning process has not been as deep or as strong as it needs to be, that's the board's responsibility. One more item on board responsibility and governance that's germane to the topic of strategic planning. Really, when you think of the work of a board, there's three different baskets, three different areas of responsibility for the board. There's the fiduciary responsibility, the strategic responsibilities, and the generative responsibilities. So the fiduciary responsibilities are pretty straightforward. Those are things like the audit, risk management, insurance, compliance issues, making sure those things are done. That's the fiduciary task of the board. The generative task is even the much higher level questions about what is going on that hasn't even arrived yet, that we haven't even contemplated yet, that we need to talk about. Another way to describe a generative question is, what are we doing today to make sure that when our kids have kids, they can attend All Saints Episcopal School or whatever your school may be. Where we are today is clearly the strategic role. So the strategic function of the board, for example, is the 12 to 24 month goals and strategies, making sure we understand the industry trends, and a SWOT analysis, which is fully understanding the strengths and weaknesses of the program, as well as the opportunities and the threats of the community that the program could be facing. So all of those things can be accomplished with a really rich strategic planning process. Hopefully the board understands the rationale for an active strategic plan. If you need to really boil down to why this is important, there's a great article in the trustee handbook, the NAIS trustee handbook, a guide for effective governance, that talks about why an active strategic plan is critical. We won't go into that whole article, but I did want to highlight just 7 specific reasons for active strategic planning. Number 1 is to control your destiny. Without an active strategic plan, schools tend to be reactionary and play defense more than offense, more than really controlling their destiny and plotting their own course, as opposed to responding whatever happens to show up. Most of the school consultants, most of the school leadership folks will tell you, you want to be in a situation to control your own destiny. You don't want to be in reactionary mode all the time. Second reason for active strategic planning is you can develop a shared sense of direction among the leadership and the board, which is critical to make sure that the head-board relationship is solid. It really makes sense that we're all rowing in the right direction. We have a shared sense of direction for the program. The active strategic planning process will really make sure that you are all on the same page, and it will identify where you're not on the same page so you can talk about that. Maximizing resources. Most of the facility folks, for example, will tell you that doing proactive maintenance as opposed to waiting for something to break down is a better use of the resource. The same thing can be said with regard to your programmatic pieces, curriculum, all of those things. Being able to time out when those purchases need to take place will generally allow you to get a better deal. So you're getting more bang for your buck when you are planning and making those purchases in a strategic way, as opposed to just whenever we can fit it into the budget. In the event a capital campaign is on your horizon, some fundraising for a new building or fundraising for a new programmatic initiative, it's critical to have an active strategic plan, especially if you're contemplating writing grants. Most grants, one of the first things they'll want you to attach in your application is your most current strategic planning process. Just to have an idea of, what's the plan for the place and how does this particular capital campaign fit into the larger vision of the school. It motivates and inspires. It also strengthens quality and accountability. It's a way to measure the progress that you're making as a program. It also can improve your marketing efforts and PR. It is a loud message to the community when you have a thoughtful strategic plan that you can unveil to not just your current stakeholders, but to potential stakeholders and future stakeholders. So it's a key piece of marketing and PR as well. Not as attractive as some of these reasons. If you're an accredited school, it's an element of accreditation as well. If you do not have a current strategic plan, that will be a challenge when you're going through the accreditation process. So while that's not addressed in this particular article, I throw that out because I know a lot of y'all are from accredited schools. So, okay, we've talked a lot about the value of the process. We've talked about why it's something we should do. Who should be involved? That's normally the first conversation that comes up when you're trying to craft a strategic planning process. So again, back to our chart, it's a board function. However, it's a board function that is supported by, I would propose, two different groups. I've seen this done different ways, but I think it makes sense to do two separate groups. What are those groups? Number one, a task force, the strategic planning task force or the committee, which is a core group of anywhere between 7 to 12 people. There's no magic number. The challenge is that if you get much larger than 12, you're going to have a heck of a time scheduling a meeting. If you get much larger than 5, if you get much smaller than 5, 6, or 7, you're going to have a hard time getting it done with all the different writing elements. But basically, the strategic planning task force is the core group tasked with writing that plan and presenting it to the board for adoption. So that's one group. However, you want to make sure that the process is informed and involves a wider variety of your constituency than just that core group. So frequently schools will do a strategic planning retreat or a series of strategic planning conversations that tend to bring in a larger group of people. That can be anywhere from 20 to 25 people, maybe even larger, depending on how you structure it, or if you have multiple retreats or multiple conversations. And this should take into consideration, obviously, the board member's voice, but administration should be involved in this. Certain faculty should be involved in this. Parents and stakeholders should be involved in this. Former parents are phenomenal to have, and if possible, and depending on the age of student you serve, former students. So if you serve, 9th grade through 12th grades, for example, it's great to have some graduates of the school. If you are a K-8 school, but you've been around for a while and you can bring in some alumni, even better. If you're a preschool, then you may want to rethink that a little bit. But if possible, former students are great people to have plugged into the strategic planning process, and former parents as well. Just really, really great resources for you to take advantage of. So, okay, let's say we've got those two groups put together, or at least those two groups kind of sketched out. What's the process look like? What do you do? So here is one approach, and I've broken this down into a handful of different steps. This is not the only model. There are tons of different models out here, but I wanted to sketch out for you one model that you can do completely internally. You can do in a quasi-facilitated way, which means that you bring in someone to help with certain steps, or you can do it in a fully facilitated way where you turn the process over to a facilitator and have them guide the community through that process from start to finish. All of those three options have pros and cons, but the process we're going to go through really works with however you decide to facilitate. So let's jump into that. So step number one is the board needs to do some pre-work. You can't just launch a process without the board doing a variety of things. Number one is the mission statement. The mission statement is the key driving understanding of why we exist. If we were looking at Simon Sinek's book, start with why. Using his language, this is the why of All Saints, or the why of St. Stephen's. Why do we exist? What are we trying to really accomplish with our school, with our community? Do mission statements change? Missions shift, and therefore mission statements should be updated. In the event you are in a situation where your mission statement needs to be updated to better to more accurately convey the mission of the school, I would say that may be work you want to accomplish before you go any further. So for our purposes, we're going to assume that we've had a conversation about the mission statement. Everyone feels pretty solid that the mission statement accurately reflects what we're trying to accomplish. If you find yourself in that conversation and you realize, oh, wow, you know what, we haven't had a conversation about the mission of the school in 25 years. Maybe we need to spend a little bit of time doing that before we craft a new strategic plan. Why? Because everything about the strategic plan should be informed by that mission statement. We're going to need something to help us decipher and work through all the awesome ideas we're going to come up with. And the mission statement tends to be that plumb line that you use. So that's the first thing that the board needs to accomplish. Next is, does everyone agree that the timing is correct? When was the last time we had a strategic plan? Do we need a strategic plan? It's going to be a flat process if half of the room doesn't think that the timing is correct. Transition in leadership can be a consideration for timing. So if you're in a leadership transition, you have to have the conversation, do we want to go behind door number one, which is craft a strategic plan now so that we know exactly who we need to hire as the next leader? That's door number one. Or do we want to go behind door number two, which is let's hold off on the strategic planning process until our new leader can be part of those conversations. So that's an example of timing. Depending on the timing of things at your school, make sure everyone around the boardroom agrees that, yes, this is the right time for the strategic plan. Select a strategic planning task force, as I mentioned. Again, no magic number. 6 or 7 on the small end, 10, 11, 12 on the large end. Make sure that task force is in place, as they're going to be the ones charged with taking all of this data and crafting the plan for the board's review and approval. Establish a facilitation plan for the retreat. I've mentioned a couple of different ways. Again, if you're going to self-facilitate or the head is going to facilitate, that's one option. Are you going to have a facilitated piece for a few elements, or are you going to have a completely facilitated strategic planning process? Depending on how you answer that question, then you get into the timeline and the budget. Because depending on how you answer the facilitation question, that will determine how quickly can we get through this process and how much is the process going to cost. Okay, so those are the first initial considerations for a board to consider before they launch into the strategic planning process. Next step, we need to gather data. Why? Because this is what's going to inform the conversations we're going to have. So what type of data? Well, number one, set parameters on this step. Why? Because without parameters, you can gather data forever. There is a non-stop amount of data, of information, of theory, of books, of charts. So you need to set a parameter on specifically what type of data do we need to look at. For example, surveys. Do we want to conduct some surveys of the constituency? Do we want to take a look at some focus groups? Do we want to do interviews of individuals to get a grasp on their understanding of our program? Basically, you want to do 4 different types of data collection, and then you need to set parameters specifically under all 4 of these categories. Why? Because again, you could spend years collecting these different types of data. Number 1 is internal data. So strengths and weaknesses of the program. What are you doing right now that's awesome? What are you doing right now that can be shored up? What are the strengths and the weaknesses? You want to capitalize on your strengths on the strategic plan, and you want to identify what weaknesses need to be addressed. So again, surveys, focus groups, interviews, student data, whatever, but make sure you're collecting a healthy amount of internal data. External data. This involves opportunities and threats. What's going on outside our walls that we need to be aware of? Opportunities could be changes in the public school world, changes in the economy in your area. Are there new employers that are coming in that could possibly bring new families that you need to be prepared for? Any new development? I've spent some time in Midland recently, and they're going through a huge boom phase right now, and there's a huge gap between the number of private school seats that are available compared to the number of private school seats that are needed to satisfy the number of families that are going into that area. An example of an external opportunity. What about an external threat? Exact same things, but negative. What's going on in the public school world that you need to be aware of? Magnet schools, charter schools, things that are potentially going to cut into your market share, for lack of a better way to describe that. What about the economy on the other side? Are there plants or large employers that are closing that we talk about? That's an example of a threat that could potentially be a challenge for you. Analysis of trends. A couple of different ways to do this, but the board needs to be informed on what's going on in independent school education, specifically Episcopal school education. One way to do this is to purchase the NAIS Trends book. It's a book that's published every year that goes through a variety of different arenas. It goes through enrollment, it goes through philanthropic giving, it goes through the economy, it goes through the student experience, and just looks at a variety of different data points for the year. That's one way to do that. We do trends webinars. Sometimes we'll do a more global trends webinars that tries to hit everything. Sometimes we'll do a trend webinar specifically on one of those areas. Those are free for members, so that's another way to do that. And then I also do live trends presentations for your school board if you want to do that as your professional development for one particular year. So however you do it, or maybe a book read, maybe you do, the board agrees to knock out 2 or 3 different books on education. There's some really great ones out there right now. If you want some topics or some ideas, email me. But regardless of how you do this, you want to do something that is getting the board up to date on what's expected of schools and what's going on in the world of education right now. And then finally, some benchmarking. How are we stacking up against other schools? The best resource for that, I think one of the best resources for that is our vital signs document. If you look under our resources page, you will find something called the SAES vital signs. These are indicators for us of strong schools. So the vital signs look at areas such as how much are you allocating for professional development? How much are you allocating toward teacher salaries? How are you approaching student-teacher ratio? Are you actively involved in strategic planning conversations, et cetera, et cetera? That's a great example of some benchmarking data. Another great benchmarking piece is the ISM. ISM stands for Independent School Management. The ISM stability markers. That's another set of benchmarks that you can take a look at if you're interested in seeing how your school stacks up. All of this data will inform the process. So be intentional about gathering data, but also be realistic. Again, you can spend all the time in the world gathering data. You don't want to just gather data because it's interesting or fun. Make sure you've got parameters on what specific data do you need as a school to inform the strategic planning process. Okay. So we've done that. We've got the group together. The board's done their preliminary work. We've got a good set of data that we're going to share with everybody so we understand how we stack up compared to other schools. We understand how, we understand the direction of Episcopal school education, what comes next. The third step is normally done in one of 2 different ways, either a retreat. When I do this, I like to do a Saturday full day retreat. Sometimes we break it up into Friday evening, Saturday morning. However, But this takes that second group. Remember, we have the first group, which is the smaller group that's going to write the plan. This step involves that larger 20, 25, 30, 35 group population that represents all of the various stakeholders in your community. So we're going to pull that group together for a pretty straightforward day of activities. We're going to share that data with them. We're going to have some good, rich conversation around that data. We're going to assume that the mission statement has been thoroughly reviewed and no changes are needed. And then we're going to create a vision statement for where do we want to go? What's wild success look like at St. James Episcopal School? What do we want to see for the future of St. James? It's an image of an ideal. It's an expression of optimism. It's basically the finish line for this particular slice of time. That's a question that comes up frequently. What's the time window for a strategic plan? I'm seeing 3 years generally as the most popular window. Sometimes I see 5 years as a window. I'm seeing a trend towards writing more frequent strategic plans for shorter periods of time, just because the industry trends and the data tends to shift so much. Whatever your window is, the vision statement is basically articulating what are we really trying to accomplish, and be aspirational. I mean, you can look beyond that window, but you need to take that window into consideration for the next step, which is developing the goals. So the goals are the broad institutional statements of intent that you need to accomplish in order to achieve the vision statement. So think of that as the hurdles that we are going to vault over in a successful way to make sure we hit the vision statement. Here's an example. So I want to play with this for the next step. One example of a goal would be the school is going to increase its non-tuition income. So perhaps one of the things that we find through our analysis of the data is that we've been increasing tuition historically at this school faster than wages have gone up. We are concerned about that. We also have benchmarked our salaries and have determined that we're not in that 85 to 90% sweet spot of our salaries compared to salaries of the local ISD. So we have concerns about being able to both attract and retain high quality faculty. However, we can't just keep increasing tuition at a really, really fast pace. We've got concerns about whether or not that's sustainable. So let's say the school comes up with a goal. We're going to try to increase our non-tuition income. Great goal, solid goal. So most strategic plans, there's no magic number, but most strategic plans have anywhere from 5 to 7 of those goals. So what happens once we've created those goals? That hopefully will be the deliverable or the end product of this planning retreat. We have confirmed the mission statement, we have articulated a phenomenal vision statement for the plan, and we have identified the 5 to 7, fewer is better than greater in my opinion. It'd be awesome if we could do 4, but we've identified the 4, 5, 6 goals that we need to accomplish in order to achieve the vision, okay? Hopefully that's where you are at the end of your Saturday retreat or at the end of your step 3 conversation. So then what? Okay, then we go to developing the action plans for each of those goals. Now we have adjourned the retreat, so that large group, we have thanked them for their service and we have told them that we were going to keep them posted, but we've thanked them. And now we're back in that task force group and we're going to have to figure out, okay, how do we achieve the goal? Now we are going back to our initial chart. Remember those 3 lanes I referenced? Now we're going from that top lane and we're sneaking down into the middle lane, because now we're getting into how do we make that goal actionable? And now we're getting into some nuts and bolts, some nitty gritty, if you will, about how we're going to achieve that goal. So for example, Let's say one of our goals was increased non-tuition revenue. An action plan may look like this. Well, we need to identify all possible alternative sources of revenue. For example, are there things that we can rent on this campus? Do we have community space that we can rent? Sports fields? Anything we can rent? Are there summer programs? Are we running summer programs that can generate some non-tuition revenue? Summer programs done well can really be a great stream of income for a school. What about extended care? The school day tends to end 3:30, maybe 4:30 with athletics. What about parents that work and need some type of extended care piece, or if you're working with younger kiddos where sports isn't really an option after school, what are we doing to provide extended care? Another example of an alternative source of revenue. So what are we doing? What do we do to identify? That's the first step, is identify what are the possible alternative sources of revenue when we take a look at our facility and our program. So that would be, action plan, step number one. What's another step? Well, develop a strategic plan for those viable streams. Let's play with summer programs. So what's a financial plan for the summer program look like? Well, we've got to talk about, how many kids can we market this to? What are the staffing needs? Summer program doesn't run itself, so we're going to have to hire some staff. Is that going to be our own internal staff, or are our faculty members really wanting to take that summer and use it to refresh and recharge? So maybe we don't want to use our faculty, but maybe we want to explore third-party faculty or third-party programs. What's that going to cost? What about marketing? What's it going to take for us to market that? Develop a budget, put all that together, and then how are we going to measure it? So what are we going to look at to determine whether or not it's a success? For this, we're going to say, it's going to be a success for us because if it's revenue, if it generates a surplus, if it breaks even and generates a little bit of income, we're going to consider it a revenue success. We don't need for it to generate, one way to look at it would be we don't need for it to generate a huge amount of revenue for us, because ideally it's great marketing and it could yield some new families for us, but we sure don't need to lose money on it. So that's one way we're going to measure success. Another way we're going to measure success is, does it yield inquiries? Does it yield folks picking up the phone and saying, my kid had a great experience at your summer program. I don't know a lot about your school. I'd love to come and tour. I'd love to visit with the head of school. That's another way to measure success. So do you get the feel for that? Obviously, it's going to be very specific and very different based on the goal, but it's just a matter of taking that goal and working it through those different planning items, and that's going to be the nuts and bolts of your plan. So again, you've got now 4, 5, 6 different goals, and the task force now has taken each of those goals. Maybe they've divided up in pairs, maybe everyone's taken one, maybe it's a group that likes to work as a whole, so they've all just gone through and worked through each of those goals, but they've developed an action plan for each of those. So now you've got the framework for a really, really strong strategic plan. What happens next? Well, I'd recommend that before you immediately take it to the board for adoption, you may want to test it out a little bit with some stakeholders. Now remember, you just had a great group of 20, 25 or so folks that spent an entire day with you, or sometimes even more, having these conversations. You may want to, I'm not saying you have to convene everybody, that's one way to do it, but you may want to just talk about what's the testing process here? How do we take what the committee has done and put it back in front of that 2025 group in some way and make sure, one, did we hear everything? Did we get everything right? Or have we missed the mark? It's quite possible that you've missed something. It's quite possible that something that you thought wasn't emphasized, maybe it was emphasized, really wasn't as important as you initially thought. A good retreat's going to have different ways to make sure you've got a gauge on how, quote, hot, unquote, certain items are, but it's really good to test that even after you've gone through that exercise. But test it. Don't just take it to the board yet. Spend a little bit of time testing it to see if the work of the task force really captured the work of that all-day retreat. One more comment about this. If there is a capital campaign in your future, then this step is particularly critical. Let's say there is a capital campaign in your future. Hopefully some of those stakeholders who are going to play a large role in your capital campaign have been involved in this process. Let's see if we are accurately hearing what they're saying before we go any further. That's really, really critical if you think a campaign is in your near future. Okay, so we tested it out. Let's say we have a coffee or a cocktail hour. We invite, if not that entire group back, as many as can come back to take a look at the framework. And let's say they say, oh my gosh, you hit it all on the head, you hit the nail on the head, this is perfect. Or if they said, you know what, that doesn't really capture what we were trying to say, so you fine tune a little bit. Regardless, now it's time for the board to adopt the process. So again, using our lanes, we were in the middle lane and now we're pushed up to the top lane again, because this is purely a board function. The board is responsible for accomplishing it. They're going to have to come up with how to pay for it. And so they will approve and adopt the final plan. One piece of advice here. So if you have tested it properly, if you have had great stakeholder engagement, push against a board's inclination to do some major rewriting at that point. If anything, the board should really, in my opinion, focus on those 4, 5, 6 goals, making sure that those 4, 5, 6 goals are the best possible goals to get us to that vision statement that we've articulated. Don't get too sucked into the minutia of the action plan. Those are great conversations, but I've seen those conversations fall into the bottom lane of the chart, get operational, and that's not an appropriate use of the board's time or the best use of the board's time. So again, the board needs to be involved in this, but whoever is driving the bus, really try to focus the board on those larger strategic questions. Have we articulated the vision properly, and have the goals that have been identified going to set us up for success in accomplishing that vision? Obviously, prioritization is going to be key, as is an accompanying strategic financial plan, because otherwise you've got a phenomenal wish list that may have anywhere from a 100% to a 0% chance of becoming reality if we haven't talked about the money, if we haven't talked about the timing. So a strategic financial plan is critical to making sure this process goes from vision, great idea, great talk, into something that's actually going to happen at your school. So then let's say the board has adopted the plan. What comes next? Celebrate. Oh my gosh, celebrate. You've just had a huge, heavy lift. One of the most important things that a board can do, communicate it. You've got an amazing strategic plan. Now share it with the world. Periodic reports from the board to the community are appropriate, especially as you tick off different action items and accomplish goals. Make sure that you celebrate those and communicate those with the community, so that we can so the community is aware of what's going on. Don't what you want to avoid is writing a great strategic plan and we put it on a binder and we put the binder on the shelf and maybe we look at it or maybe we don't. Another thing you want to avoid is we're making great progress, and nobody knows. Maybe some faculty members know, maybe some parents know if they're lucky enough to look in the right spot. Celebrate it and communicate it. Okay, and then that takes us to step 8, which is just implement. One of my favorite quotes is, even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. So even if you're on the right track, you got to keep moving. So what does that look like? If you are in an active strategic plan, at the minimum, the board should quarterly use a consent calendar and dedicate their entire board meeting to plan implementation. What do I mean by a consent calendar? A consent calendar is where you take all of the normal reports that hopefully people pay attention to during a board meeting. Quite frequently, people doze off or check emails during reports, but financial reports, head of school report, enrollment report, all those fiduciary things. Once a quarter, take all of that, send that out in a packet, make sure everyone reads it, approve it as a consent calendar item, which means that there's one vote where the board adopts all that documentation or addresses questions that come up, and use the entire board period, the board meeting time, as a time to discuss plan implementation. It's not going to get done otherwise. This is a board function. Don't forget, remember, we're in the top lane. So you're not done when the plan has been adopted. It's the board's responsibility to make sure that there's follow through, that there's available resources, so that you're making forward progress on the strategic plan. Okay, let me stop there. I see a couple of questions, so let me stop and answer a few questions. Number one, should the task force include members of the board? I see this as an avenue for boundaries being crossed on what is board work and what is operations. Okay, good question. So we're talking about not the retreat group, but the task force. Should it include members of the board? I think it probably should. Why? Because when the smoke clears, the board's going to have to adopt the work of the task force. If there is absolutely no board presence on that task force, then I think it is, I think there's a potential for a disconnect. So when the task force takes its work back to the board, there's not going to be necessarily a lot of engagement. So let me also validate some of the concerns that you have crossing between board work and operations, because you are getting into that shared lane and potentially one lane even lower. So I think you need to be intentional about what board members are on that task force, but I don't know if I would create a task force with no board members at all. I think that could be a little bit dangerous. But I think I understand the concern about lines being crossed between board work and operational work. It's definitely going down the chart when you get into the minutia of the plan. I think that's a good concern, but I'd be a little bit worried about doing no board members. I'm trying to think if I've seen. I don't think recently I've seen task forces created with no board member presence at all, but something to think of, something to think about. Here's another question. I've seen some really detailed communications packages. What's the best way in terms of delivery? So if you're talking about, I want to make sure I understand this question. So you're talking about detailed communication packages of the plan. So I think narrative is way better than fancy charts for that piece. I've seen lots of schools publish very flashy, awesome marketing pieces that sell the plan, that communicate the plan to the constituency, and it really becomes almost like a view book. I've seen that as well. PowerPoint slides, any kinds of presentations like that are fine. I would just encourage you to focus on story and narrative as much as specific minutia, if that makes sense. Ask me another question if you've got some more specific questions about that. But I've seen a wide variety of different ways to share the communication. I love seeing a really great brochure pamphlet of a strategic plan with pictures that talk about the history of the school, that talk about the 4 goals, and talk about some of the implementation plan. You may not want to publish all the implementation plan because some of those things are going to be strategic. But you also may want to do just a narrative letter from the head that describes the strategic plan. I've seen that as well. Recently, I've seen videos, NAES, so our sister association, the National Association of Episcopal Schools, they just adopted their strategic plan, and they did a video. They did a pretty straightforward video, and nowadays it's not complicated to do a video where the head of school or the executive director talks about the four action or the five goals, the 4 or 5 goals, doesn't really get into the specifics of the action plan because it's going to be hard to do that in a video that you want to keep 3, 4, or 5 minutes. But that's another great way to communicate as well through videos. So, and again, now, 5 years ago, doing a video was expensive and costly and really, really tough. Now it's really easy. It's easy to do a video, record it, edit it on your laptop or find someone to do some of that editing for you. It's a pretty effective way to do that as well. Okay, let's take a look at where we are next. So the third unit today are just some additional readings and resources. So I wanted to put, 4 things to share with you. We have a document that's called Setting the Strategic Direction of Your School. You can take a look at that under our resources page. I've mentioned the vital signs. Another thing to take a look at would be the association standards, or I think the full name for that is Association Standards for Accreditation. Those are great resources for you to take a look at. Surveys. I mentioned surveys. So that's great, Dave, but where do we get surveys? Well, you can create your own surveys. That's easy. It's easy to administer your own surveys through a free SurveyMonkey membership. You can do a paid SurveyMonkey membership and do all sorts of fun bells and whistles where it does a lot of the statistical analysis for you and generates slides for you. We can administer those for you. Our surveys are free to use. You can download. We have surveys for parents. We have surveys for faculty. We have surveys for board members. I think we even have a student survey for schools that work with older kids. You can download those and use those or adopt those as you see fit. If you want a turnkey approach, then we can administer those surveys for you for a flat rate per survey. So again, that's another example of it kind of depends on what your budget is and how much time you have on your hands. You can do awesome surveys on your own, or you can hire someone to do the whole thing for you. Another great resource for surveys, NAIS. NAIS has an entire library of surveys. And again, you just buy those per survey. I think you may even be able to hire them to craft specific surveys for you. But we see a ton of surveys, so if you crafted a survey and want some feedback, feel free to send it my way. I'd be happy to give you some feedback as well. I do that for member schools all the time. And then obviously, I've mentioned facilitation services, which is a fee-based service that we provide to our schools that will do as much or as little of this as you need. 3 great books I want to offer. 1, the NAIS Trustee Handbook. Great resource. I referenced one article from that on the value of strategic planning. NAIS publishes a book entitled The Strategic Process. If you want a soup to nuts approach to the strategic process, that's a great book to take a look at. It is thorough, very, very thorough. So as you flip through the pages, you may or may not want to do everything that they recommend. But if you want a thorough, probably one of the most thorough approaches, take a look at that book. Finally, David LaPiana. This is a great book. This is called The Nonprofit Strategy Revolution. Now, I have this book out there. This is a little more, this pushes the envelope a little bit more. David suggests that you get away from the traditional model of strategic planning that we're talking about, where every 2 or 3 years you get together and figure all that out. What David recommends is that rather than doing a multi-year plan, you do every year the board is engaged in strategic planning and strategic thinking. So he recommends you go that route. I don't have a lot of schools that are doing that. I like that approach. There's a lot in that approach that I think makes a ton of sense. But if you are interested in a, more kind of forward-thinking approach to strategic planning, specifically from the nonprofit world, David LaPiana's Strategic Planning Revolution is a really, really thought-provoking book. It also is very hands-on activities, frameworks for how you implement this in your particular nonprofit. Really, really good stuff. So that's a great resource as well. Okay, I've talked at you for a long time, so I apologize, but I really get excited about this topic, and there's lots of good things for us to discuss. So I'm going to stop there and give you a little bit of time to ask any questions you may have about the strategic planning process or how to do this in your school. So gang, I'm not going to run off. I don't see any additional questions. Let's see. Let's see if we can do this. Okay, we've got folks that are raising their hands. So we're going to see if I'm talented enough to, let's see if I'm talented enough to turn on the microphone of someone. Okay, Melissa. Melissa was the first to raise her hand. So get ready, Melissa. I don't know if this is going to work or not, but I just turned your mic on. So if you unmute your mic in the bottom left-hand corner, I think you can ask a question. Is Melissa there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I do. I feel very much like Larry King right now.
Ooh.
Waco, go ahead with your call.
Can you hear me, David?
I can. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Hey, by the way, hi. How are you?
Hi.
A quick question. We're in the process of our self-study right now, which of course so much of it is strategic in nature. Would you recommend trying to initiate a strategic plan during this process or wait until after you finish your self-study?
And I think, you're getting pretty close, right? You've got a visit next year, correct?
I do.
Yeah. So I don't know if I would try to bite that off as well as a self-study and a visit and a strategic plan. That feels like a lot to me. Mm-hmm. So what will happen is you will probably get a raised eyebrow if you don't have a current strategic plan. And the way you can respond to that is just that we're in the planning process and we felt as if trying to do a strategic plan was, we were afraid it wasn't going to be done properly, if that makes sense.
That makes sense.
So that, it's going to turn into a compliance question. I will tell you that that's not uncommon. My concern about you trying to do all of that is whether or not the resulting strategic plan will serve you, if that makes sense.
Right.
So
well, I feel like with our period of transition that the self-study will lead us to a point where we'll be ready to approach a strategic plan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that makes sense. I think that, again, depending on when your last strategic plan was, that will absolutely come up in the accreditation piece. And
right.
It very well may be something where, they say, as a condition of continued accreditation, we need to see forward motion on this in 60 days or 90 days. The committee and the standards committee could come up with something like that. So, but you just address it, call it out and say, you know what, we could do one of two things. We could rush through the strategic planning process and get it done to check the box, or we could be honest that we don't have one right now and we're going to hear the feedback from the visiting team, use that to inform our strategic planning process and get one done as soon as feasible.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Oh, you bet. Thank you. Okay, let's see who is next. So I'm going to now go to Luis Delgado. So Luis, if you will go to the bottom left hand, you've unmuted. Hi, Luis.
Hello.
How are you?
I had a very similar question, which is, when do you start the strategic planning process? When do you undertake this activity?
Yeah, so I see it done kind of at different times depending on the life of the school. I've seen it done at the start of the year, right as things get started. I've seen it done in the spring as the academic year is wrapping. Part of it depends on the urgency, how quickly you feel like we need to have these conversations. I don't know if there's an ideal time to do it. I think I see most of the time it's done either in the spring towards the end of the year or at the start of a year.
Okay. Thank you.
But really, a lot of what drives that, Lewis, is going to be how quickly does the board need to have these conversations so that we can know what our strategic plan is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, one of the challenges, of course, is coordinating everybody's schedule.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, the July is probably not the best time to do it.
Yeah.
So I think some folks try to grab everyone before they scatter for summer. I think some folks try to grab everyone right as they're coming back in from the summer break. Those kinds of considerations should be explored.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's see. Joel Bicknell. Let's see. I am going to, Joel, let's see if I can do this. Joel, it doesn't look like it's working. Oh, there you are. Okay, Joel, you are on. Amarillo, go ahead with your call.
David, how are you?
I'm well. How are you? I'm going to see you soon.
That's right. I just wanted to offer to Melissa that we are doing something very similar in terms of our timeline. And if she would like to walk that path together with me, I would value that.
Perfect. Yeah. Are y'all, if I remember, do y'all both have visits next year?
Yeah, our visit's in October, and we're going to kick off our strategic planning process in January.
Yeah, and that's, you may want to, that makes sense. And so again, if you're not, are you in compliance if you don't have an active strategic plan? No, you're out of compliance. But so long as you can articulate that we're being thoughtful about it and here's how we're going to address it, you may get, like I said, it may be a situation where they're going to require some follow-up documentation to ensure that you're in compliance, but you're being thoughtful about that process, I think.
Yeah. And then I had a different question. When we are sitting down to look at our budget for next year, as we look at setting aside an appropriate amount of money for a strategic plan, I'm sure that is somewhat tied to the ranges of facilitation that you choose. Could you give us some ballpark numbers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I'm telling you, create a budget, but what could that look like? So, yes, to answer your question, it goes specifically to how much facilitation you're needing. So if the facilitation is just, for example, surveys, we want someone to do our surveys. Those surveys can be a couple $100 a piece. So if that's probably the lightest level of facilitation. If you're looking for someone to come in and do, let's say, the surveys and maybe the Friday evening with the board or the task force and then facilitate the full day retreat, that's going to be, closer to $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 probably. If you're looking for someone to also be there to help guide the crafting of the plan, that's going to be a little more time, probably another couple thousands as well. If you're looking for a turnkey approach, I've seen everything all over the map on that. I've seen everything from $10,000 all the way up to, larger schools will pay $20,000, $30,000, $35,000 for that. It comes down to, it's kind of like, legal counsel. It really comes down to how many contact hours you're going to need. But, if you are just starting from scratch, if you put in $5,000, I would think that would get you an adequate amount of facilitation. It would not get you a turnkey, but it would get you an adequate amount of facilitation, for a medium-sized school, if that makes sense. Does that help at all?
David, that's very helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
And again, you can probably find folks that are going to be a little bit less. I guarantee you can find folks that are going to be considerably more as well. Okay, let's see. Oh, I forgot to lower people's hands. I'm sorry. I've got to lower people's hands. Okay. So I've lowered everyone's hand. So I think we have answered all the questions. Thank you, Galen. Got a nice note. Thank you all so much for those nice questions. Oh, here's a really good question from, okay. Is there or should there be a distinction between the strategic planning committee and the financial portion of strategic planning? Should there be a separate financial strategic planning task force? Great question. I don't think there should necessarily be a separate financial strategic planning task force, but there most certainly should be a separate financial strategic planning document. And what does that look like? Well, that looks like, let's say we've identified in the action plans different items we need to purchase or different things we need to improve. In the same way that the strategic plan envisions we're going to accomplish this in 3 years, maybe 4 years, there should be a corresponding document or spreadsheet that talks about, okay, here are the year one strategic planning costs, and here's the total amount for year one. Here are the year two items we're going to knock out. Here's the total cost for year two, et cetera, et cetera. That can be a separate document. More often than not, that's a bottom lane or an operational question. The board is going to need that information, but more often than not, it's the head and the administration that's tasked with getting all that information pulled together. Sometimes the finance committee receives the strategic plan and then develops the strategic financial plan. So to answer your question, it needs to be a separate document. I don't think you need a separate task force for that. To me, that's more of an administrative and a finance committee function of your board. Good question. Really good question. Okay, gang, I'm not going to run off. I'm going to stay online for a few more minutes. So if there are any other questions, feel free to send them my way. You've got the website address on your screen. You've got the phone number for our office, and you've got my email. We are here to serve you. We are here to provide whatever support we can as your school association. So don't hesitate to reach out by email or call if there's anything we can do. And I will stay online for a few more minutes if there's any other follow-up questions. Otherwise, thank you all so much. Happy Wednesday, and look forward to seeing you soon.